All right, now we're going to talk about the adolescent brain and cognitive development. So, there's this phenomenon called the teenage brain, and I want to just highlight something really big is happening to the brain during the adolescent years. And these are the main themes of what's going on. Um, Myelination and pruning, what's happening or not happening in the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, social cognition, and I really want to talk about this evolutionary advantage. So first, let's talk about pruning and myelination. What's pruning? So the gray matter are these connections between the neurons, these pathways. What happens is pruning is getting rid of connections that aren't used, right? It's paring back unused pathways. So by the time someone gets to the end of adolescence, they have more gray matter at the start of adolescence than they had at the end of adolescence. Now there's this expanding of white matter, and that's myelination. Myelination is the fatty substance that surrounds the long, skinny part of the neuron. And what that does is it makes the signal go faster. So pruning is getting rid of what's not used, and myelination is making what is used operate more efficiently. So, and I have some evolutionary examples of what pathways might be myelinated in different people. So, for example, a Hawaiian teenager will reinforce the pathways that help her make decisions about negotiating big waves in a canoe. An Alaskan teenager will reinforce pathways that help him cross a frozen ocean without falling in. A city teenager will reinforce pathways conducive to riding a subway safely. And a farm teenager might reinforce pathways to detect when rain will fall. But in each one of those, a Hawaiian doesn't really need to know much about ice. And so anything that was prepared to be a pathway that was going to recognize that is gone. It's done with. And so you keep what you use. Other things that are going on is the prefrontal cortex is still baking. I say it's still in the oven. So the prefrontal cortex, as we know, this is where executive function sits. This is where your decision making goes. This is where your planning goes. The ability to, for lack of a better word, be a grown-up about something, really think something through, all the multiple variables and weigh the risks and the benefits, to think ahead. All of that is not yet developed, and it won't be fully baked until age 25. It's in the process of getting there, but it's going more slowly. What is already fully baked is the limbic system. That's deep in the brain. That's in full swing, and as we read in our textbook, it's turbocharged. This is what makes emotions so intensely felt during adolescence. So if you remember, we read at the beginning of chapter 11, G. Stanley Hall, in the beginning of the 1900s, wrote about the storm and stress of adolescence. In many ways, this idea of storm and stress can be tied to the limbic system brain develop being like, full speed ahead, while the prefrontal cortex, which makes decisions and may be involved in regulating emotions and reframing thoughts and decisions, that's not online. So there's this sort of reactivity and emotionality it's not that adolescents want to be difficult. It's that their brains are functioning this way. They can't help it. And so this is a really big insight, to know that this is how the adolescent brain develops. But there's another part that I think is maybe even more important, at least for parents when they're trying to make sense of their teenagers and why they're acting that way. And that's the whole relationship, or what I should say, the development of the circuitry involved in social cognition. So social sensitivity is in overdrive during this time, unlike any other time in life. So I'll read to you this quote from this research. Evidence is mounting to suggest that while processing information is relevant to social evaluation and the internal states of other people, adolescents respond with heightened emotional intensity corresponding to a nonlinear recruitment of socioaffective brain circuitry. So what's happening is an adolescent is going along processing just the information of life, and they're recruiting socioaffective, that means socially relating and emotional brain circuitry in response to things that adults don't make such social or emotional responses to. So this circuitry involves the amygdala, the striatum, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the ventromedial and lateral prefrontal cortices. And those all have been seen to be strongly influenced by hormones released in puberty. So the hormones related to puberty are actually activating certain brain regions and putting them into overdrive. So now there's this heightened emotional response to social stimuli, both positive and negative. So if somebody likes you, you're on top of the moon. And if somebody looks at you sideways, you're devastated. There's also a vigilance about social evaluation. I know that my own son was, if I had just this, if I was tired someday and I said something in a certain low affect mood, he took it so personally, like, get off my back. I was like, oh, I didn't know I was on your back. And this I attribute to, and I had learned, fortunately, at the time that he was an adolescent, I was learning about some of this stuff. So I learned that, oh my, his crazy interpretation of my just probably a tiny bit negative, but closer to neutral way of talking was actually something that's because of these regions in the brain being on hyperdrive and making him so much more vigilant, and the feeling of being judged and the feeling of being looked at. So that's an aspect of adolescence. And then there's a much higher degree of thinking about how others think. So here's another piece of research that pretty much finds the same thing. But one of the things that's true is that this whole region is more active in teens than adults. It's also associated with storing knowledge about the self. Right? So what's really interesting about these brain regions is it's not just I'm interpreting you and wondering what you're thinking, but it's also hand in hand storing knowledge about the self. So it's almost like our brains are giving us evidence that we are social creatures, that we barely even know who we are unless we know how someone else sees us or thinks of us or is looking at us or is accepting us or rejecting us. So it's believed that this brain region is less active in adults because the habits about thinking of oneself are already formed. So this is also another point. So by the time you hit 26, 27, maybe you've already formed your own self-concept and you have a level of your own self-esteem. And in that, you don't have to go back and question again and again and again, because you've sort of found your answers to some of the questions about who are you. I want you to also be thinking about this when we're talking about teen identity and the need to create the sense of who you are during this phase. Now, I just want to take a minute and reflect on the evolutionary adaptiveness of all of this. It's not that often in lifespan textbooks that they stop and they bridge and connect the different developmental stages. But when we look at what's happening in the teenage brain, I am just so inspired to connect you to childhood. So what's happening in infancy? You're forming attachments. You're eliciting care from others in the group. What's happening in toddlers? Now you're using your senses to understand the physical properties of the world. Okay, so there's society, I'm being cared for. There's the world. My senses are telling me about it. Now children use their faculties and their abilities to understand what they can and can't do in the world. So the group accepted me. I understand what makes something fall. And now I can understand what my own body can do and what my own mind can do. So here we come to adolescence. And now what's really on overdrive at adolescence? The social and intellectual and emotional sensitivities are now on hyperdrive. So adolescents use these to understand what the group needs and what the world needs. So there's all of this forming of awareness and understanding about what the world is. But now with my social sensitivities and what am I getting rewarded for or approval for or rejection for are all me understanding what's needed in this group. And adolescent pruning and myelination reinforces the circuits that are needed and gets rid of the circuits that aren't. So that makes reasoning and thinking and intellectual ability more efficient for this environment, right? So, they talk about, the infant being born a blank slate. Well, we're not a blank slate. We're programmed to do certain things. For example, discover the world and need each other. But through those, it makes us incredibly flexible for adapting to new environments and cultures that have adapted to environments. So emerging adults, then, what happens when you're 25 and your prefrontal cortex becomes fully baked? Now your executive function is organized based on the abilities of the individual and the needs of the world they are in. It's pretty nifty. And here's just a link to a documentary that is pretty excellent. It's about an hour long. It's Frontline on PBS, and I highly recommend it. Now we're going to talk about adolescent cognitive development. And there's some themes here that we'll talk about and we'll get to. First now, Piaget. Oh, it stopped. Oh, no, it didn't stop. Something else happened. Sorry about that. We will just continue. I got confused for a second. Piaget's formal operational stage, it's really all about now being able to use your imagination, abstraction, to say what if this, then that, to use logic. And I want to just emphasize the difference between abstract and concrete thought, right? So here's concrete thought is based on real things that you can directly observe or touch. And my example here would be a chair, a taco, or tears. You can see those things. Those are things that you can see and touch. An abstraction is based on the idea of a thing. So seating is an idea of a thing. Food is an idea of a thing. It incorporates many different types of foods. Or injustice is an abstraction. So there's now in adolescence, you're moving toward using more and more abstract ideas instead of concrete ideas. You still use concrete ideas. That's what I shouldn't have said instead of, in addition to, is what I should have said. And then deductive reasoning, just so you know, that starts with a theory, and then you apply that theory to different situations. And that's different than inductive reasoning, which starts with the situation, and then you form a theory from it. Let's just move on. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that not all adolescents or adults engage in formal operational thinking. alas, Piaget, we don't all become scientists. But most people actually rely on shortcuts in their thinking most of the time, right? So you may have heard some people talk about heuristics, mental shortcuts, things that you're familiar with and you just assume to be true, assumptions. So just in honor of that amazing part of psychology, there's a lot to be studied about our cognitive bias. Many of our cognitive biases are incredibly useful, and sometimes they get in the way of actually seeing the world the way it should be. So rather than go through all of this at this moment, I just wanted to make sure that you saw this beautiful chart of all the biases that have been documented by psychology. Um, and I don't have time to go into them, but it is a really interesting area of psychology. So when we talk about in development that we develop this formal operational way of thinking, I just want to remind you that doesn't mean we suddenly all become logicians. We actually are all still engaging in many biased, quick, handy ways, rules of thumb and thinking. So, during adolescence, there's an increased intellectual capacity. You're better at math, verbal. You have special abilities that increase. You have a bigger memory. Your attention becomes more selective and more sustained. Your abstraction is more frequent, which we talked about, and your knowledge of the world expands. So, what happens with all of this increasing capacity? Oh, you start to question authority. So that's another behavior that adolescents are also known to have, which is questioning authority. Don't tell me what to do. But within that, there are certain ways of thinking that are emerging in our, and I think they're awesome. I think they're beautiful. Like there's an idealism that is often associated with adolescence. You know, that things can be better, that things can be good. There's also poking holes in explanations. Like if you're, if you remember, we watched a video of the girl who kept saying why. Hopefully you watched that video with me, at age 3. It was like, why, why, why? And she just took the explanation for whatever the mother said. It didn't have to make sense. She just took it in. She just absorbed it. But in adolescence, if an adolescent asks why, especially if it's why can't I borrow the car, they're going to poke holes in your reasoning. That's the evidence of their advanced cognitive capacities. And also, there's a big sensitivity to hypocrisy at this age. Like, oh, you tell me that I can't go, but you went down there. There's just they're pointing out things and they're making connections at a much more sophisticated level. And so when these kinds of some of this behavior might end up annoying you, now, when when your child becomes a teenager, you're going to think back to this class and you're going to go, oh, yes, this is just their wonderful cognitive abilities coming online. That's what I'm hoping. So there's longitudinal research on parental authority, right? So if adolescents are questioning authority, well, what do we know about parental authority? And I found this research from 500 Chilean adolescents. So they were surveyed once a year for 4 years. And what the researchers were interested in were the belief in the legitimacy of parental authority and the obligation to obey, right? Do adolescents believe their parents have authority and should they obey? And what they saw is that over the 4 years of adolescence, those beliefs declined. No, they don't have authority, and no, I don't have to obey. So it starts out really high at the beginning of adolescence, and at the end, there's a steep decline. However, parental quality had an impact on whether or not that declined. So parents who were supportive and had a healthy degree of monitoring, of being interested and where are you going and what are you doing, they had an increased likelihood that the adolescents would see parents as legitimate and that they should be obeyed. So parents who are supportive and attentive to what the child is doing are more likely to be obeyed. Egocentrism and imaginary audience is another quality of adolescent cognition. Egocentrism here, it's perceiving that they are the focus of everyone's attention. It's also associated with the development of social processing areas of the brain. And the thing that I want to, so I'll tell you the story about Melissa Lavoie. I should have said her name. She's probably married and will never see this, but it was an actual real person. And we were in high school, and we were sitting in the bleachers at a basketball game, and it was filled with people across the way in those bleachers, and we were on these bleachers, and she turns to me and she says, with all so serious, she's like, "Are my eyelashes sticking together?" And I remember I had this moment of like clarity when I just was like, I sort of looked around and I was like, and I said, "Nobody's looking." And the look of hurt on her face, she was like, she, she, it was like it never occurred to her that nobody would be looking at whether her eyelashes were sticking together while she's sitting at a basketball game. But to me, that's a story of how powerful imaginary audience can be. It's not because she was vain or anything. She was just a normal girl who was really obsessed with, looking in a certain way and thought that everybody was looking at her, and crushed when I told her that they weren't. Anyway, but then here's something to consider. Is the social network, the likes, the followers, are they imaginary audience? I leave you with that question. I actually don't think that I know the answer. I don't think that research knows the answer. Are they real or are they imaginary? Don't know. Think about it. But another thing I want to point out is that egocentrism is not selfishness. In fact, as adolescents grow older, across the span of adolescence, selfishness declines. So in this research of 190 participants, they looked at 3 age groups: childhood, early adolescence, and middle adolescence. And what they found was that the older they were, they behaved less selfishly, and they were more motivated by fairness, the idea of things being fair. So selfishness declines as they grow older. Now, we're almost done. We only have a couple more slides, and I just want to mention the transition to school is being especially difficult. Moving from class to class, being the youngest in school. So transitioning from elementary school to middle school is very hard, and when you compare test scores across countries, the scores in the United States drop after the transition to middle school. And so there's been a lot of thought put into how to design middle schools so that they're less detrimental to performance. And the fact is that the jury's still out. But it's something to pay attention to, as like if you're parenting a child as they go into middle school, it's almost like you may want to prepare them to know that it's going to be confusing and such. Also with school, another piece of good news is that the dropout rates are declining. There was a big gap in the 90s with Hispanics dropping out of school much more frequently than the other races and ethnicities. And that's declining over time. One thing that we read about in our textbook was that Hispanics, more than any other ethnicity or race, tend to have, in the past at least, referred to financial need as one of the reasons why they drop out of school. And that is also on the decline, as being the gap between is declining. And lastly, um, let's just take a moment to think about working during school. We didn't read too much about it in our textbook, but when people have jobs in school, it has sort of a double-edged sword. It encourages a sense of independence and contribution. That's great. But on the other hand, it may harm grades and prevent involvement in activities. And we know that activities are helpful and they lead to positive development in youth.